What's up everyone, Alex here. I think that Trails Through Daybreak is the perfect game for RPG fans who've been wanting to get into the series for years. This is actually a pretty big deal, because for decades, Trails fans have long debated which game newcomers should start with. Fortunately, last year's Trails into Reverie provided a clean break and a fitting epilogue to the massive 10-game arc that started all the way back in Trails in the Sky First chapter. And as its namesake implies, Trails Through Daybreak serves as a new beginning. But is it good? Trails Through Daybreak is a Japanese-style RPG with both action and turn-based combat, developed by Falcom and published by NIS America, who provided me with this PS5 game code. In Trails Through Daybreak, you play the role of Van, an investigator who's often hired to take on jobs that other organizations won't handle. A chance meeting with a new client sets the stage for an adventure that'll have him searching 8 genocide, artifacts that are seemingly attracting the attention of everyone in the criminal underworld. I'll be talking about 3 things in my review. First, I want to talk about the exciting changes to both Daybreak's combat and orbment systems. Second, I want to address some things that didn't sit well with me. And finally, I'll be talking about its presentation and its story. Spoiler-free, of course. The most exciting part of Trails Through Daybreak for me is that you can now defeat enemies in either action combat or turn-based battles. This is a big deal because there's never been a JRPG released that's attempted to include these 2 distinct gameplay styles in one game. For the exception of forced turn-based battles, which include major bosses, you'll have the option to defeat enemies in either action combat or turn-based battles. During action combat, you're only given control of your party leader, with the AI controlling other party members. Every character has a basic combo, a dodge roll, and a charge attack. Charge attacks can inflict massive stun damage to your enemies. These attacks can only be used whenever your charge gauge is filled up, by attacking enemies or performing perfect dodges. Each character's attack ranges vary. For example, Van has both close-range basic and charge attacks, but Fairy has a ranged basic attack and a close-range charge attack. Each enemy is weak to either physical or magical attacks. So, for example, you'll want to use Van to inflict powerful physical damage, whereas you'll use Agnes to inflict powerful magical damage. Unfortunately, none of your arts and crafts are available during action combat. You can activate your shard at any time to engage in turn-based combat. If at least one enemy is stunned during shard activation, your enemies will receive some damage in addition to delays in their turn. Turn-based combat feels similar to previous Trails games, albeit with new quality-of-life features. When trying to activate an art or craft that has positional bonuses, an indicator will show up on enemies if you're in the proper position. It's now easier to see if you have an art or craft equipped that specifically targets an enemy weakness. And along those lines, you no longer have to scan enemies for weaknesses. That said, there are new features and changes that shake things up a bit. You're able to spend shards from the new S boost gauge to boost your characters and power them up. Some of these power-ups vary per character. For example, S boosts increase Agnes' healing potency, while Van's damage increases. Spending 2 shards fully boosts a character, further enhancing these power-ups. Your S boost gauge increases every time you deal and take damage. S crafts now require you to spend 2 shards. Trails Through Daybreak no longer has powered up S crafts that spend 200 CP. This results in being able to use the same S craft back to back, if you have maxed out your CP. The cost will change depending on your character's boost status. For example, if one of your characters is partially boosted, you'll only need to spend 1 shard from your S boost gauge to use S crafts. Whereas if your character is already in full boost, you can use S crafts at any time. This was implemented so that you can't use S crafts back to back early on in combat. Every time an S-Craft is activated, your S-Boost capacity will increase by 1, and it will remove your character's boost. SCLMs replaced the link system in previous games. This is a new positional element that requires you to stay in close proximity to another party member. Its perks include having your connected party member follow up after using your regular attack, or power up your arts and crafts. You only have to be next to another party member during the turn that your action is activated in order to obtain said perks. For example, if one of your characters is in the middle of a long cast, you can move another character closer to activate SELM before their turn, and that will count once their cast time is up. There's one other aspect of Daybreak's combat that I will leave for you to discover, as I don't want to spoil the surprise. The orbment system in Trails Through Daybreak has received a major overhaul as well, making it a lot easier to work with. In previous games, the orbment system hid and continually piled on a layer of complexity over time that intimidated new fans. Trails Through Daybreak removes these abstractions in favor of making its system more approachable. The best way to think of the orbment system is that it's essentially a souped-up materia system from Final Fantasy VII that takes into account where you place them. Each Sypha features 4 lanes, with locked slots that you can unlock by spending Sepith. Each lane has corresponding shard skills, which act as passive buffs. These can be turned on by equipping enough orbments that fulfill that shard skill's elemental requirement. Additionally, you also have arts drivers that lets you equip up to 2 additional arts, allowing you to further customize your character. So let's make sense of all these details. Before playing through Trails Through Daybreak, I initially thought that the action combat would be a great way to take out lower level enemies. And while that is definitely the case, the action combat is really just a more complicated way to stun opponents and gain initiative in turn-based combat. I would love it if the action combat had more depth, as its simplistic nature can wear on you over time. That said, the changes to make both its turn-based combat and orbment system more approachable is absolutely a welcome change. The new quality of life features in turn-based combat go a long way in helping players make smarter decisions as they formulate their strategy, while new features like SELMs throw in some added considerations when positioning your characters on the field. And the new orbment system makes it far more approachable and fun to play around with loadouts that you can further refine over time. All in all, it's probably my favorite combination of systems in any Trails game. While the gameplay in Trails Through Daybreak is pretty good, I do want to point out a few things that just didn't quite sit well with me. And since I feel that this is the perfect starting point for the Trails series, I thought it'd be good to highlight some long-standing traditions for newcomers to let them know about its quirks. Trails Through Daybreak on PS5 has frame rate issues. And by the way, I want to state that I'm the type of person that doesn't complain about frame rate. But in Daybreak's case, the frame rate issues were immediately noticeable. The game exhibits frame pacing issues, causing the screen to judder during camera pans. Frame rate drops also occur during cutscenes with lots of characters, most notably during S-crafts. Unfortunately, there isn't an option to cap the frame rate like in the PS4 version. Now, a future patch can add this option, but as of my playthrough, there weren't any options available. As with most Trails games, the game features sections with partially voiced dialogue. As a series veteran, I'm used to these sorts of things, but newcomers will definitely find these strange and feel like it's a bug. There are portions of the game that feel overwritten, making scenes go on for far longer than they should be. One noteworthy section is when a game spends a good chunk of time explaining to someone what movies and movie theaters are, something that could have been addressed by a simple one-sentence fade-out. While I admit that this is more of a personal stylistic preference than anything, as I do acknowledge that Falcom's writers aren't anything but succinct, this starts to get a bit grating after experiencing it for 10 straight games. And speaking of personal preferences, the party menu's items being mapped to individual face buttons rather than traditionally selecting them seems a bit unnecessary. The reason why other RPGs map out actions to face buttons during combat is to evoke a sense of action by removing the menu selection element and making your commands more reactive, and therefore, actiony. Given that reason, this feels like the changes to the party menu are an unnecessary oversimplification, though I can see some people liking the more muscle memory-oriented nature of it all. But the biggest issue that I have with Trails Through Daybreak is the way its new timeline works. Instead of a linear timeline like in most RPGs, Daybreak's turn orders are split between characters on the left and enemies on the right. If a character or enemy reaches the middle of this timeline, then they get to make their turn. This change blurs how turns are ordered, adding a tinge of reluctance on the part of the player, as things aren't as clear as they really ought to have been. Now, you can press a button to see numbers pop up indicating whose turn it is, but this isn't available when selecting arts and crafts to see how your character's placement in the timeline is affected before you commit to the action. I do want to point out that based on screenshots and footage alone, that it seems like its sequel has returned to a version of the linear timeline that we're all familiar with. But also, you can no longer steal timeline bonuses, removing a layer of strategy to the game. Though there is a shard skill that you'll need to equip that lets you do that. Snafus aside, the presentation and story of Trails Through Daybreak blends some of my favorite things about the Trails series as a whole. Trails Through Daybreak sports a brand new custom engine, and despite the aforementioned hiccups, combining this with a story that reminds me a lot of the best parts of Trails from Zero, which is my favorite game in the series, easily made me feel invested in it. The brand new custom engine allows for seamless transitions between action and turn-based combat, though trying to spot the improvements between previous and current gen versions of the game might be difficult for most. That said, character expressions are typical of Trails, but the main cast sports more colorful and varied looks when compared to the previous series. Even if you can make the argument that Van is basically a recolored Rean Schwarzer, and Agnes is just a restyled Alyssa from the Cold Steel series. As mentioned earlier, the overarching narrative reminds me a lot of Trails from Zero, in that they use Edith as an anchor for your activities, while allowing us to get to know our surroundings as the game progresses. This is only enhanced by Falcom's slavish attention to detail, where every single NPC's dialogues change whenever a major event occurs. This also means that much of the game is spent doing side quests from said city, or its surrounding towns, in order to help ground you to this new locale. Some might feel that this slows down the pace of the story by forcing you to do menial tasks, but this sense of familiarity is baked into the heart of every Trails game, as its writers can wield this to great effect whenever they want huge events to happen. The way the game opens up sections of Edith as you progress through the story feels rewarding, ensuring that there's always something new at every turn, and the constant drip feed of new characters keeps it fresh, from both a narrative and gameplay perspective. New to Trails Through Daybreak is an alignment system that determines which factions you can ally with at a certain point in the game, giving you unique events and dialogue as a result. The game also features the return of the connection system, which lets you improve your relationships with your party members by spending a portion of the day with them. If there's one way that I can describe Trails Through Daybreak, is that it combines the technology that Falcom has been building on top of over the years with the very best elements from Trails from Zero's narrative design. But I think that small description doesn't give enough credit to the game's incredibly fun take on combat and its streamlined customization systems, which are not only complementary to each other, but also signals a bold step forward in the series. And like I said in the beginning, with last year's Trails into Reverie closing a huge arc in the Trails series, Daybreak effectively serves as a fitting beginning, which makes it the best game to start if you've never played a Trails game before. And quite frankly, with its fresh new coat of paint and a story and gameplay that's firing on all cylinders, I can't think of a better game to introduce new RPG fans to this long-running series.